All right, welcome to week 8. I broadly describe covert action as a third way in the overview. Lowenthal describes covert action as an activity or activities of the United States government to influence political, economic, or military conditions abroad, where it is intended that the role of the United States will not be apparent. In a nutshell, this means the U.S. government occasionally finds it necessary to try to manipulate the affairs in other countries without doing so overtly. In other words, kind of put the thumb on the scale in the service of American national interests. The problem, as I noted in my overview, is that covert actions rarely remain covert in this media-intensive age, and the publication of covert affairs often creates more trouble for the formulation and conduct of foreign affairs than the trouble the covert action was designed to address. An important question to ask is whether covert action is an artifact of the Cold War. That has a couple of dimensions. Did the U.S. not engage in any kind of covert actions prior to the creation of the intelligence community, which would happen around the Cold War? Was the nature of the threat posed by the Soviet Union so significant that it justified manipulating the domestic affairs in other countries, and that no longer seems to be the case? How serious must a threat be to justify covert action? Are the threats confronting the United States so diminished that we can publicly state as a matter of principle that the U.S. would never engage in violation of other nations' sovereignty? Here we face a dilemma as old as history. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. We are not weak. One thing I consider to be important for conducting covert operations is the absolute requirement for an infrastructure in order to conduct those sorts of operations. Most covert operations require what intelligence officers call plumbing, which includes safe zones for exchanging sensitive data and a considerable amount of technical support. And you need those resources and capabilities on standby in order to conduct such operations. Lowenthal catalogs from 1948 to 1973 some of the covert actions that have been undertaken in order to control events in other countries. We manipulated elections in 1948 in Italy. We overthrew the government of Iran in 1953, of Guatemala in 1954, and Chile in 1973. The last action, which really was a series of propaganda, party funding, and ultimately economic destabilization actions that resulted in the military coup in Chile, provoked a series of congressional hearings. And the Pike Church Committee hearings were a huge embarrassment to the intelligence community and led to reforms which seriously undermined the status of covert action on the part of the intelligence community. It shouldn't be a surprise that the succeeding Carter administration was extremely reluctant to pursue any sort of covert action. And the one time the administration attempted a defense-recommended special operations invasion of Iran to rescue American diplomats held hostage, the operation failed spectacularly. So Carter, clearly that was not a high point in covert actions. Congress's role in the formulation and conduct of foreign policy was really front and center in what became known as the Iran-Contra scandal. Two important events caused these very separate events to be tied together into a mess that paralyzed the Reagan administration's final 2 years. First, you had the 1979, another significant thing that happened in 1979, the 1979 overthrow of the Nicaraguan Somoza family's authoritarian rule by the Soviet Cuban-supported Sandinista National Liberation Front, which placed Central America on the forefront of what would be the articulation of the Reagan Doctrine, which was a determined effort to roll back Soviet influence in Central and Latin America by whatever means. Second, the Soviet Union's invasion of a faltering Afghan satellite regime, also in 1979, created, an incoming Reagan administration, created what they thought was an opening to covertly aid the Mujahideen fighters opposing Soviet occupation. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, which then can become your enemy again, as we discover. Congress's role in this begins with the Boland Amendment, which was a rider attached to a must-pass defense authorization bill that Reagan simply couldn't veto in that day and age, which banned the Reagan administration from providing any sort of military aid to the right-wing organized insurgency that was attempting to overthrow the Cuban-supported Sandinista regime. That group was called the Contras. That was ultimately the agitating factor that led minor staffers on the National Security Council, if you believe this, to surreptitiously sell Stinger missiles to Iran so that they could be smuggled into Afghanistan to help the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And the proceeds of those sales were then diverted to the Contra fighters in Nicaragua. As scandals go, this was an incredibly labyrinthian affair. We're not really sure how far up into the administration it goes. A lot of people tend to characterize the Iran-Contra affair as sort of a, will not, kind of a Henry the whatever, will not someone rid me of this meddlesome priest, with Reagan occupying the role of Henry going, well, I sure would like to do something for those Contras. So that scandal, coming within 10 years of the Church Pike Committee hearings, really affected the intelligence community. But how much? How much do we know about this? Two final issues I want to address, for the forum. First, there's been a fight taking place, between the Director of National Intelligence and the Director of Central Intelligence over who should have control over covert operations. Both Bush Jr. and Obama preferred that the DCI should remain in control over those kinds of covert operations. Who do you think should have control? I mean, operational control. The other point is the blurring lines between covert operations run by intelligence or special operations run by the Department of Defense. What differentiates a covert operation from a special operation? I'll give you an idea of just how goofy it is. If the Department of Defense issues a UAV strike and they kill somebody, that's considered a special op. If the CIA does it, it's considered a covert op. So, how arbitrary are these distinctions in some instances? In some instances, it's a question of whether it happens during the day or at night. So it's kind of bizarre. The one thing we do know, though, this is sort of a rule of bureaucratic politics. If a bureaucracy develops a capability, they are going to use that capability. If we allow defense to develop a very large paramilitary capacity, which is to say larger informal units similar to what the Russians have, then defense will want to deploy that capacity, and that could, find us in a position where we're doing a lot more of that kind of stuff, for right or for wrong, and we're not sure about that. So let's talk about it. There is an article in the course resources by Jennifer Kibbe from a couple of years ago, actually several years ago, from Foreign Affairs. It's called The Rise of the Shadow Warriors. I think that's an interesting read. It kind of augments what Lowenthal was saying. So obviously, again, there's a lot to discuss, a lot that I haven't talked about that we can discuss. So let's have a great week of engaged discussion.